The dust cloud on the horizon made Ethan's heart race with anticipation, but when the wagon finally creaked to a stop in front of his modest ranch, his world turned completely upside down. Standing before him was not the delicate petite woman he had imagined through months of careful correspondence, but a figure that seemed to defy every expectation he had harbored. At 7 feet tall, Ethan Caldwell had always been the tallest man in 3 counties, his lanky frame casting long shadows across his homestead like a gentle giant made of bones and sinew. But the woman stepping down from Fletcher McKenna's wagon was barely 4 feet in height, so small that she had to use a wooden step stool the driver hastily arranged just to reach the ground safely. This cannot be happening, Ethan thought, his throat constricting as he stared down at Charlotte Beaumont, whose golden hair barely reached his waist. The wedding ring he had whittled from pine during countless lonely evenings suddenly felt enormous in his pocket, designed for hands he had imagined would be proportional to his own towering frame. The advertisement he had placed in the Territorial Herald 3 months prior echoed mockingly in his memory. Honest rancher seeks gentle companion for frontier life, must appreciate simple pleasures and quiet conversations under starlit skies. Charlotte's neck craned back at an almost impossible angle as she attempted to meet his gaze, her cornflower blue eyes wide with what appeared to be equal measures of shock and determination. Her traveling dress, practical and well-made, seemed to emphasize just how tiny she was against the vast backdrop of Montana wilderness. Fletcher McKenna shifted uncomfortably beside his wagon, his weathered hands fidgeting with the leather reins as he witnessed the obvious mismatch between his 2 passengers. "You must be Ethan," Charlotte said, her voice carrying a surprising strength despite her diminutive stature. She extended a hand that disappeared entirely when he cautiously offered his own massive palm in return. Her grip was firm and sure, suggesting a spirit far larger than her physical form would indicate. The small crowd of neighbors who had gathered to witness the arrival of Ethan's mail-order bride began whispering among themselves with barely concealed amusement. Mrs. Patterson from the Mercantile actually giggled behind her lace handkerchief, while old Ben Crawford shook his head in apparent disbelief. Young Timothy Miller pointed openly before his father cuffed him sharply across the ear and dragged him away from the spectacle. For 3 long months, Ethan had treasured Charlotte's carefully penned letters that spoke of shared sunsets, cozy conversations by crackling fires, and the simple joy of 2 lonely souls finding companionship on the frontier. Her elegant script had painted pictures of domestic tranquility that filled the empty spaces of his isolated ranch house with imagined warmth and laughter. Never once had she mentioned that she would need a ladder to reach his kitchen shelves, or that he would have to bend nearly in half just to hear her speak in normal conversation. Charlotte's own letters had been equally romantic in their expectations. She had written of long walks across rolling meadows, of dancing under starlight, and of finding solace in the strong arms of a man who could protect her from the harsh realities of frontier life. The reality of Ethan's towering, almost skeletal frame, so tall that he had to duck through every doorway in town, was clearly not what she had envisioned when she accepted his proposal through correspondence. Fletcher McKenna cleared his throat nervously, breaking the awkward silence that had settled over the gathering like a suffocating blanket. "Well, I suppose you 2 have some talking to do," he mumbled, beginning to unload Charlotte's modest trunk from the wagon bed. The wooden chest looked almost comically large next to her petite frame, reinforcing the growing sense that nothing about this arrangement was going to proceed as either party had planned. The morning after Charlotte's arrival brought an emergency that would test both of their capabilities in ways neither had anticipated. Ethan's prize mare, Tempest, had somehow injured herself during the night and was now limping badly in the far pasture, clearly in distress and refusing to come when called. The horse was notoriously skittish around strangers and had a tendency to panic when approached by anyone she didn't trust completely. Ethan stood at his fence line, wringing his hands as he watched the valuable animal favor her left front leg with obvious pain. At 7 feet tall, his movements tended to be awkward and threatening to nervous livestock, and Tempest had never quite warmed to his towering presence, despite months of patient effort. The mare's injury appeared serious enough to require immediate attention, but getting close enough to examine her seemed impossible given her agitated state. "She's frightened," Charlotte observed quietly from beside him, having appeared at his elbow with the same surprising stealth she had demonstrated since her arrival. Despite her tiny stature, she moved with remarkable grace and confidence. "And she's protecting that leg by keeping weight off it. We need to get her to the barn before it gets worse." Ethan nodded miserably, feeling the familiar weight of his own inadequacy settling on his shoulders like a heavy yoke. His neighbors had always questioned his decision to raise horses, noting that his unusual height and gangly movements seemed to make the animals nervous. Most folks assumed that someone his size should be able to handle livestock through sheer physical presence, but the reality was quite the opposite. Without warning, Charlotte ducked under the fence rails and began walking toward the injured mare with small, measured steps. Ethan hurried after her, his long strides quickly closing the distance despite her head start. "Charlotte, wait," he called softly, not wanting to spook Tempest further. "She doesn't like strangers, and when she's hurt, she can be unpredictable." But Charlotte was already halfway across the pasture, her attention focused entirely on the nervous horse. As they approached, Ethan could see the full extent of Tempest's distress. The mare's ears were pinned back against her head, and she danced nervously away from their approach, clearly torn between her need for help and her instinct to flee from potential threats. Then, Charlotte did something that made Ethan's breath catch in his throat. She began humming softly, a low, melodious sound that seemed to float across the morning air like a gentle breeze. The tune was unfamiliar to him, but there was something hypnotic about the way it rose and fell with the rhythm of her breathing. Tempest's ears immediately swiveled forward, and her nervous dancing gradually slowed to a more manageable fidget. "Easy, beautiful girl," Charlotte murmured, her voice carrying the same musical quality as her humming. She continued her slow approach, never making direct eye contact with the mare, but maintaining a steady stream of soft sounds that seemed to calm both herself and the injured animal. "You're hurting, aren't you? But we're going to help you feel better." Ethan watched in fascination as Charlotte reached into her skirt pocket and withdrew what appeared to be a small apple, cut into neat slices. She held one piece in her open palm, extending it toward Tempest without moving any closer. The mare's nostrils flared as she caught the sweet scent, and despite her injury, she took 2 tentative steps toward this tiny woman who seemed to pose no threat whatsoever. The transformation was remarkable. Within minutes, Charlotte had gained Tempest's trust completely, her small hands moving with practiced confidence as she examined the injured leg. The mare stood perfectly still for this examination, something she had never done for Ethan despite months of patient effort on his part. "It's not as bad as it looks," Charlotte announced, her voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who clearly knew her way around horses. "She's got a stone wedged in her hoof, and it's causing all the pain. Once we remove it and clean the area properly, she should be fine within a few days." As Charlotte led Tempest back toward the barn with surprising ease, Ethan found himself reassessing everything he thought he knew about strength, capability, and partnership. His mail-order bride might be small enough to use his boot as a chair, but she possessed skills and knowledge that he had never even considered when he placed his advertisement in the territorial newspaper. Word of Charlotte's success with the injured mare spread through their small community with the same speed as news of her unusual size. By afternoon, curious neighbors had found various excuses to visit Ethan's ranch, their eyes darting between the oddly matched couple as they worked together to care for Tempest and repair the fence where she had initially injured herself. Marcus Sullivan, the town's blacksmith and a man who measured worth primarily through physical strength, arrived with his 2 teenage sons ostensibly to help with the fence repairs, but his real interest was clearly in observing the dynamic between Ethan and Charlotte, trying to understand how such a mismatched pair could function as a partnership. "Heard your little lady has a way with horses," Sullivan commented, leaning against the fence post with studied casualness. His boys arranged themselves behind him like an audience, their eyes fixed on Charlotte as she moved around Tempest with confident efficiency. Mighty unusual for someone so compact. Ethan felt heat creep up his neck as Sullivan's implications became clear. The blacksmith was questioning whether someone of Ethan's size could provide proper protection and guidance for such a small woman, while simultaneously wondering if Charlotte's diminutive stature might somehow diminish Ethan's standing in their traditional frontier community. "Charlotte grew up on a horse farm in Kentucky," Ethan replied, trying to keep his voice steady and confident. "She knows more about animal care than most people twice her size." It was true as far as it went, though he had learned this fact only that morning when she casually mentioned her background while examining Tempest's injury. Sullivan's eldest son, a strapping young man of 20 who had inherited his father's broad shoulders and confident manner, stepped forward with the kind of assurance that came from never having his capabilities questioned. "Maybe she'd like some help moving those feed sacks," he offered, gesturing toward several heavy bags that needed to be transferred from the wagon to the barn. "Looks like tough work for someone so small." Charlotte looked up from cleaning Tempest's hoof, a task that required her to stand on a wooden crate just to reach the proper angle. Her expression was polite but distant as she considered the young man's offer with the same careful attention she had given to the mare's injury. "I appreciate the thought," she said pleasantly, "but I've developed my own system for handling heavy items. Might be better if you helped Ethan with stretching that new wire for the fence." Her tone was perfectly cordial, but there was something in it that discouraged further offers of assistance while simultaneously redirecting attention to where it might actually be useful. The rejection stung Sullivan's boy in a way that was immediately visible across his features. His shoulders stiffened and his jaw clenched as he realized that this unusually small woman had no apparent need for his strength or protection. His younger brothers exchanged glances that spoke volumes about their collective confusion regarding the proper social dynamics of such an unprecedented situation. Ethan watched the interaction with growing unease, recognizing the wheels turning in Marcus Sullivan's head as the blacksmith made calculations about power, perception, and community standing. Men like Sullivan lived by clear, uncompromising rules about who was strong and who was weak, who led and who followed. Charlotte's presence disrupted those traditional patterns in ways that made certain people deeply uncomfortable. But what troubled Ethan most profoundly was his own reaction to the scene unfolding before him. Part of him felt genuine pride in Charlotte's competence and self-reliance, her ability to handle situations that would challenge people twice her size. Another part of him wondered if her capabilities somehow highlighted his own inadequacies in ways that would become impossible for their community to ignore. That evening, as the last of their curious neighbors finally departed, Ethan found himself alone with Charlotte for the first time since her arrival 24 hours earlier. The silence between them felt heavier than the humid air that preceded summer thunderstorms, weighted with unspoken doubts and thoroughly shattered expectations. They sat on opposite ends of his small front porch, the physical space between them measured not just in feet and inches, but in the accumulated weight of mismatched dreams and uncertain futures. Charlotte's legs barely reached the edge of her chair, while Ethan's knees nearly touched his chin, despite the custom furniture he had built to accommodate his unusual height. Charlotte broke the silence first, her voice carrying a weariness that hadn't been present when she faced down the injured mare that morning. "This isn't what either of us expected, is it?" She wasn't looking at him as she spoke, but rather staring out at the darkening horizon, where the first evening stars were beginning to appear like tiny pinpricks of hope in an uncertain sky. Ethan shifted uncomfortably in his chair, the wood creaking under his weight, despite his naturally lean build. "I should have been more specific in my letters," he admitted, though even as he said the words, he wasn't entirely sure what exactly he could have written that would have prepared either of them for this reality. Should he have mentioned that he had to have all his doorways specially constructed, that most furniture required modification before he could use it comfortably, that he sometimes felt like a circus curiosity in his own community? About what? Charlotte turned to face him directly, and her forthrightness caught him completely off guard. About being tall enough to see over most buildings? About having neighbors who assume height equals capability? There was no mockery in her voice, but there was a sharp understanding that made Ethan wonder what experiences had taught her to recognize such social dynamics so quickly and accurately. The honesty in her question demanded an equally honest response, even though such emotional vulnerability felt foreign and dangerous to him. "About feeling like I don't fit," he said quietly, his voice barely carrying across the small space between them. "Not just physically, but in the life I'm trying to build out here, about feeling like I'm too much of everything and not enough of anything that actually matters." The admission hung in the air between them like smoke from a dying campfire, acrid and impossible to reclaim once spoken. Charlotte was quiet for a long moment, her fingers drumming a slow, thoughtful rhythm against the arm of her chair as she processed his unexpected confession. When she finally spoke, her voice held a gentleness that surprised him completely. "You know what I saw today when you watched me with Tempest?" She didn't wait for his answer, continuing with the same directness that had characterized all their interactions since her arrival. "I saw a man who cared more about the horse's welfare than his own pride. Most men would have insisted on handling it themselves, would have seen my success as some kind of personal failure." Ethan felt something loosen in his chest, though he wasn't entirely sure if it was relief or something more complicated and harder to define. The observation she had made suggested that she saw qualities in him that he had never recognized in himself, perspectives that had nothing to do with physical measurements or community expectations. "And what I should have written," Charlotte continued, her voice taking on a more personal tone, "was that I'm tired of being seen as delicate or helpless, that I've spent my entire life having people assume I need protection from everything, including my own decisions." She paused, studying his face in the gathering darkness. "That I've never met a man who didn't try to make me feel smaller than I already am, whether they meant to or not." The revelation shifted something fundamental in how Ethan understood their situation. All day he had been focused on his own inadequacies, on the ways he didn't measure up to some imagined standard of masculine capability. But Charlotte's words suggested that she carried her own burdens, her own reasons for seeking a life away from the constant judgments and assumptions of others. "So what do we do now?" he asked, genuine curiosity replacing the anxiety that had plagued him since her arrival. The question felt important, like they were standing at a crossroads that would determine not just their immediate future, but the entire trajectory of their lives together. Charlotte reached into her dress pocket and withdrew a folded piece of paper that looked worn from repeated handling. The edges were soft with age and frequent folding, suggesting it was something she had treasured and returned to many times during their months of correspondence. "Do you remember what you wrote in your fourth letter?" she asked, unfolding it carefully in the dim porch light that filtered through the windows behind them. "You said that you believed real partnership meant two people making each other stronger, not one person making the other feel diminished or inadequate." Ethan did remember writing those words, though they had seemed almost foolishly idealistic when he penned them by lamplight during one of his loneliest winter evenings. He had worried that such sentiment might drive away potential respondents who expected more traditional arrangements based on clearly defined roles and responsibilities. "I meant it when I wrote it," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully. "But I'm not sure I understood what it would look like in practice." He gestured toward the barn where Tempest was resting comfortably, her injury treated with a skill and confidence he could never have managed alone. "Today made me realize how much I don't know about my own land, my own animals." Charlotte refolded the letter and tucked it away, but not before Ethan caught sight of other papers in her pocket. More of his letters, he realized, kept and apparently reread enough to show where. The thought that his words had been important enough to preserve gave him an unexpected surge of something that might have been hope. "You know what I noticed today?" Charlotte asked, shifting in her chair to face him more directly. Despite the growing darkness, he could see the earnestness in her expression, the way she seemed to be weighing her words carefully before speaking them. "When Tempest got hurt, you didn't run to get help from Sullivan or any of the other men in town. You came to find me." Ethan hadn't thought about his actions in those terms, but she was absolutely right. When crisis struck, his instinct had been to turn to her, not because he expected her to solve his problems, but because somehow he had sensed that she would understand what needed to be done. It was a level of trust that surprised him given how recently they had met. "In my last letter," Charlotte continued, "I wrote that I was tired of being alone. But I didn't just mean physically alone. I meant being alone with my thoughts, my struggles, my dreams for what life could be like if I found the right person to share it with." She paused, studying his face in the gathering darkness. "I think maybe we both advertised for someone to rescue us from loneliness. But what we might actually need is someone to be lonely with sometimes and strong with other times." The distinction she was drawing felt profoundly important, though Ethan wasn't entirely sure he grasped all its implications. Traditional marriage arrangements in their community seemed to follow predictable patterns. The man provided protection and resources, the woman provided domestic skills and companionship. What Charlotte was suggesting sounded more complex and more honest than those familiar roles. "So we try," he said finally, the words coming out more like a statement than a question. "We try to figure out what partnership looks like when it doesn't fit the usual patterns." Charlotte nodded, her expression serious, but not without warmth. "But first," she said, standing and brushing dust from her skirt, "you're going to show me how you plan to propose because technically we're still just two strangers who happen to be sharing a porch." Her tone was light, but there was something in her eyes that suggested the formality mattered to her more than she was letting on. Ethan felt his pulse quicken as he realized she was absolutely right. In all the confusion and awkwardness of her arrival, they had never actually addressed the fundamental question of whether they wanted to proceed with marriage. Ethan's hands trembled slightly as he reached into his vest pocket and withdrew the small wooden box he had been carrying since dawn. Inside lay the ring he had carved from a piece of maple that had fallen during the previous winter's storms, its surface polished smooth by hours of careful, methodical work. It was simple and unadorned, nothing like the gold bands that wealthier men could afford, but he had poured months of hope and loneliness into its creation. "I had planned to do this properly," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "to wait until after we had talked, until I was sure you weren't disappointed by—" He gestured vaguely at himself, at the modest ranch, at everything that wasn't what she might have expected based on their romantic correspondence. Charlotte stepped closer, close enough that he had to bend down significantly just to maintain eye contact. She could smell the honest scent of hard work on her clothes and see the genuine curiosity in her eyes as she looked at the ring box in his massive hands. "May I?" she asked, extending her hand toward the box. When he nodded, she lifted the ring carefully, turning it in the moonlight to examine the grain of the wood and the smooth finish he had achieved through patient effort. "You made this yourself," she said, and it wasn't a question. Her voice held a note of something that might have been wonder. "How long did it take?" As she spoke, she slipped the ring onto her finger, testing the fit. It was enormous on her tiny hand, sliding easily past her knuckle and threatening to fall off entirely despite her best efforts to keep it in place. 4 months, Ethan admitted, his heart sinking as he watched the ring fail to fit properly. "I started it the day after I received your first letter." The failure of something so basic felt like a metaphor for everything that had gone wrong since her arrival. He had imagined her hands as proportional to his own, had carved the ring to match his fantasy rather than reality. But instead of disappointment, Charlotte's face showed something entirely unexpected. She smiled, a genuine expression that transformed her entire face and made her look even younger than her 23 years. 4 months, she repeated softly. You spent 4 months making something for a woman you had never met, based on nothing but letters and hope. She looked down at the ring, still loose on her finger, despite her efforts to keep it in place. "Do you know what that tells me about who you are?" she asked, her voice carrying a warmth that hadn't been there during their earlier conversation. Ethan shook his head, not trusting his voice. The evening had already contained more emotional honesty than he typically experienced in months of frontier isolation, and he felt wrung out by the intensity of it all. "It tells me you're someone who believes in taking care with important things," Charlotte said, her words measured and deliberate. "Someone who puts thought and effort into creating something beautiful, even when no one is watching to judge your work." She slipped the ring off her finger and held it up between them, the wood gleaming softly in the moonlight. "And someone practical enough to know that rings can be resized, but character cannot." The simple statement hit Ethan with unexpected force. All day he had been focused on physical inadequacies, on measurements and comparisons that seemed to matter so much to everyone around them. But Charlotte was suggesting that there were other ways to measure worth, other kinds of strength that might matter more in the long run. "So is that a yes?" he asked, the question coming out more uncertain than he had intended. Charlotte's answer came not in words, but in action. She took Ethan's enormous hands in her own tiny ones and placed the wooden ring in his palm, then guided his hands to close around it with gentle pressure. "Ask me properly," she said, her voice gentle but firm. "Not because you think you should, or because we made an arrangement through letters, but because you want to." Ethan looked down into her face, really seeing her for the first time since she had stepped off Fletcher McKenna's wagon. Yes, she was smaller than he had expected, almost impossibly tiny compared to his own towering frame. But there was also a strength in her eyes that hadn't come through in their written correspondence, an intelligence and humor and something that looked suspiciously like genuine affection despite their brief acquaintance. "Charlotte Beaumont," he said, his voice growing steadier with each word, "will you marry me? Not because of letters or arrangements or what other people expect, but because I think we might be able to build something good together, something neither of us could build alone." "Yes," she said simply, and the word hung in the evening air between them like a promise. "But I have conditions." The addition made Ethan's stomach tighten slightly, but her expression remained warm and encouraging. "I want us to resize this ring together. I want to learn how to work with wood, and I want you to teach me. And I want you to let me teach you about horses and cattle and all the things I know that might be useful here." The relief that flooded through Ethan was so intense it almost made him light-headed. Her conditions weren't demands for him to change who he was, but invitations to share knowledge and skills, to build the kind of partnership she had described earlier. "I'd like that," he said, meaning every word. All of it. 1 year later, 12 months later, as autumn painted the Montana Valley in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, Ethan and Charlotte stood before their neighbors in the small community church. The wooden ring, now properly sized and accompanied by a matching band Charlotte had carved for Ethan during the long winter evenings, fit perfectly on her delicate finger. Their partnership had proven as unconventional as their first meeting, but it had also proven remarkably effective. The ranch prospered under their combined efforts. Ethan's careful attention to detail and methodical approach, paired with Charlotte's intuitive understanding of animals and practical problem-solving skills, had transformed the modest homestead into one of the most successful operations in the territory. Tempest, now fully recovered and serving as the foundation mare for their growing horse breeding program, had produced 2 healthy foals that promised to be as beautiful and spirited as their mother. More importantly, the horses responded well to both Ethan and Charlotte, having learned to trust the gentle giant who provided patient, consistent care and the tiny woman who seemed to speak their language fluently. More importantly, Ethan had discovered that strength truly did come in many forms. While he might never match Charlotte's intuitive connection with animals or her ability to solve practical problems with lightning speed, His patience and methodical approach had taught her the value of planning ahead and thinking through challenges before confronting them directly. The whispers and speculation of their neighbors had gradually given way to respect and even a touch of envy. Other couples in the community had begun to notice how Ethan and Charlotte worked together, how they consulted each other on decisions, how they seemed to genuinely enjoy each other's company even during the mundane tasks of daily ranch life. As they spoke their vows that crisp October morning, Ethan caught sight of Marcus Sullivan in the congregation. The blacksmith, who had once questioned their unusual partnership, now nodded approvingly as the couple promised to honor and support each other through whatever challenges lay ahead. The mail-order bride arrangement that had brought them together was largely forgotten now, replaced by something much more valuable. A partnership built on mutual respect, shared responsibility, and the kind of love that grew from truly seeing and accepting another person exactly as they were. Their height difference still drew occasional stares from strangers passing through town, but their neighbors had grown accustomed to the sight of the gentle giant and his tiny wife working side by side, each contributing their unique strengths to build something neither could have achieved alone. As winter approached and they prepared for their first full year as husband and wife, Ethan often found himself marveling at how wrong his initial expectations had been. He had advertised for a companion to fill the silence of his lonely ranch, but what he had found was so much more, a partner who challenged him to grow, who saw strengths in him that he had never recognized, and who had taught him that the most important measurements in life had nothing to do with physical dimensions. Charlotte, for her part, had discovered that protection came in many forms. While Ethan might not be able to shield her from physical threats through brute force, his steady presence and unwavering support had given her the confidence to pursue dreams she had never dared voice before. Together, they were planning to expand their horse breeding operation, to build the kind of life that honored both their individual strengths and their shared vision for the future. On quiet evenings when they sat together on their porch, watching the sun set over the rolling Montana hills, they often reflected on the strange circumstances that had brought them together. Neither had received what they thought they wanted from their mail-order arrangement, but both had found something infinitely more valuable. A partner who understood that true compatibility had nothing to do with matching expectations and everything to do with complementary strengths. Their story became something of a legend in their small community, passed down as an example of how love could bloom in the most unexpected places when two people were brave enough to look beyond surface appearances and social conventions. The gentle giant and his tiny bride had proven that the best partnerships were built not on conformity to traditional roles, but on the courage to create something entirely new together. As they built their life together, season by season and challenge by challenge, Ethan and Charlotte discovered that their physical differences, which had seemed like insurmountable obstacles on that first dusty afternoon, had become symbols of something much more profound, the beautiful truth that love comes in all sizes, and that the strongest partnerships are often built by the most unlikely pairs. Their ranch continued to prosper, their love continued to deepen, and their neighbors continued to marvel at the extraordinary partnership that had grown from such an apparently mismatched beginning. In a world that often measured worth by conformity to expected standards, Ethan and Charlotte had created their own measures of success: mutual respect, shared laughter, and the quiet satisfaction of building something beautiful together, one careful day at a time. If you enjoyed this tale of unexpected love on the frontier, you'll want to hear more stories of courage, romance, and the untamed spirit of the American West. These are the stories that shaped a nation, told by the people who lived them, loved them, and left their mark on the wild frontier that would become our home.